Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Bills with Luke Scorzell. Obviously, one of the most important parts of the policymaking process is getting that policy through legislatures themselves. On Bills, we've talked a lot about the research, economics, and public policy concerns regarding that process. But today we have the unique opportunity to hear from someone who is involved in what is often the final step of the United States Congress. For this episode, I sat down with Austin Petersen to discuss his run for the Senate. This episode was recorded on January 26th, 2018. Stay tuned for our interview. I'm Luke Scorzell, and you're listening to Bills. Hello, and welcome back to episode 27 of Bills with Luke Scorzell. In 2016, Austin Petersen was the runner-up to Governor Gary Johnson for the Libertarian Party presidential nomination. Then, on July 4th, 2017, Austin announced his candidacy for Missouri's Senate seat, challenging current two-term Democratic incumbent Claire McCaskill. Today, he joins us on the show. Thanks for coming on, Austin.
Thank you for having me.
In an interview with Dave Rubin last year, you two threw around the idea of running for president again in 2020. So what exactly changed your mind and then motivated you to run for the Senate instead?
Well, I think running for office many times is about timing, right? It's not necessarily about just wanting to be someone who takes political office. I think that there was a gap in the 2016 election cycle that needed to be filled by somebody who was a pro-life, pro-constitutional, libertarian. And I didn't feel that Governor Johnson was, really representative of the ideas that I believed to their fullest extent. And I thought he needed some competition, so I jumped in the race. I don't think that there is, at least I don't foresee that there's going to be the same kind of demand for a presidential candidate in 2020 with those kinds of credentials. At least I'm not getting that impression that there will be. But when I looked at my home state of Missouri, I saw that one of the least popular Democrats, Claire McCaskill, was up for re-election. And I thought, well, maybe it would be a good idea to try and run against her to give her some competition because she's so unpopular. And so I called all my supporters and spent, about 2 months, made over 4,000 phone calls and asked if I should run. 100% of those people said yes. And then when I asked what party I should run under, 98% or more said run as a Republican. So since they're the people who are donating, volunteering, spending all their time trying to make this happen, I figured I should listen to them. And I joined the Republican Party to run for the Senate.
You are now a Republican. You've been a Libertarian for, I guess, the rest of your life. So how then will your Libertarian background actually influence how you govern as a Republican? Will you be more of a Rand Paul type Republican?
Yeah, I identify with people like Rand Paul and Senator Mike Lee and others, people who share our ideas in the Freedom Caucus, like Justin Amash and Thomas Massey. And I think that I would be very similar to them, but not exactly like them. We're all very different and have different backgrounds and ideas, but they're definitely the closest to what I believe. And it's funny, I just got off a phone call with a Missouri voter where I was introducing myself to her for the first time. And she said, she was a little suspicious. She says, "You're a Republican?" And I said, "Yes, I am, ma'am." And she says, "Okay, well, just so you know, we don't support the party. We're Republicans, but we don't support the party." And I was like, "Okay, well, what do you mean?" She goes, "Well, we only support the candidate. We don't support the party. We're a little skeptical of the Republican Party right now." So then she sat down and asked me questions about my personal beliefs. And when I had, and I was forthcoming with her, told her that I was an independent or a libertarian before, she said, "Well, I totally understand why," because I made the joke that Republicans often they'll run like libertarians and then govern like Democrats.
Yeah.
And she laughed and said that I should send her a mailer, with an envelope to make a donation and a little bit more information about my campaign. So score one for Liberty.
Yeah. So presumably then you will govern as hopefully a libertarian. One of the biggest problems in our country at the moment really seems to be, and the tax bill is evidence of this, the massive spending and all of the entitlement programs that we have. And like you said, Republicans get elected as libertarians and then they tend to govern like Democrats and they're seemingly unable to actually cut spending. So do you have some ideas then for actually cutting spending once you're in Congress?
Absolutely. So my plan that I think we should enact is the penny plan, which instead of trying to kill one department or another entirely, which of course there are many departments I think we could, do away with, I think that a simple 1% spending cut across the board to every program, 1 penny out of every federal dollar, is a good way to go so that the special interests don't cry too loudly if you tried to do something like get rid of PBS or the National Endowment for the Arts or whatever. If you just simply make a 1% spending cut across the board, then I think you could make reasonable cuts, and that would put us on the path towards a balanced budget. And then after that, we could do something like pass a constitutional balanced budget amendment, or we could even do something like pass spending cap reform, which other countries like Switzerland and others have had good success with. And I think that that would be the reasonable way for us to move forward.
You mentioned a balanced budget. The last time I think we actually had the budget balance was when Newt Gingrich was in Congress. So is that something that you're looking to do if you get elected to the Senate?
Yes, absolutely. Senator Mike Lee has actually introduced a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. Of course, you have to get your spending under control first before you can do that. So I think that, once we can get our spending under control, if we can elect some good liberty Republicans, some real true constitutional conservatives, then we can pass a balanced budget amendment. But we're definitely going to need some backup, and that's one of the major reasons I'm running.
And do you see a wave of those conservative type Republicans coming into Congress, or are we moving away from that? I mean, President Trump at the moment isn't really the most conservative president, one could say.
It's tough to say. I mean, I don't, when I think of conservative, I don't think of Donald Trump, but his policies, on the other hand, if you can get past the personality, I think that the policies have actually been very conservative or libertarian. I mean, the tax bill was probably the biggest tax cut we've had since Ronald Reagan, and the stock market is soaring. He's cut more regulations than George W. Bush and Barack Obama combined. He's pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord. I mean, the man doesn't seem to be a big fan of big government, from what I can tell. And I think a lot of people I think there's a lot of Trump derangement syndrome out there, that they don't care for how Donald Trump comports himself. But quite frankly, if at the end of the day the president is tweeting like a madman but cutting regulations and cutting taxes, then that's what I like to see. That's really all I care about. I want to see the policies of limited government enacted.
Certainly, he's cut a lot. So you brought up the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and the new tax bill. What are your feelings on that? It will increase the federal government's debt over the next 10 years by around $1.45 trillion. But at the same time, we're seeing many companies, including Apple, bringing their money from foreign accounts back into the United States, and there were cuts across the board for Americans. So how do you feel about the bill in general?
Well, a lot of economists believe in the Laffer curve, which states that if you cut taxes, you actually get more revenue because more people have more money that they can use to spend, and they'll go and they'll pay that into the system through sales taxes and fines and other and fees and different things like that when they're engaging in economic activity or what have you. The problem, of course, is that when you're looking at the national debt, you can criticize a conservative if they voted for increasing spending as well. Yes, they voted for a tax cut. Great, I agree with that. But if they voted for a spending increase, then that's a problem. But I want to be the Republican who votes for the spending cuts and for the tax cuts. So it's not inconsistent. I mean, you can't attack a Republican who votes for the spending cuts as well. I mean, you have to delineate between those who are really part of the problem and say, hey, these Republicans voted for the spending increase and the tax cut, so they're inconsistent. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. But I think that, if you really want if you want economic growth and the gains to be locked in that we have, you do have to be honest. We do need spending cuts. So, if the national debt increases by 1.86 trillion or whatever the number was that you suggested, then that's a sure sign that we have got to cut spending in order to balance that out.
So you mentioned the across-the-board spending cuts of just 1%. Are there any specific areas that you would want to cut entirely? I know you have talked about on your website about a complete repeal of Obamacare.
All right, so I don't think that the federal government should be involved in health care. So, yeah, obviously getting rid of Obamacare and all the healthcare exchanges, I think, would be a good thing in order to stimulate a competitive market economy that we need in healthcare. But I also think that, for example, if I don't trust the government to run my healthcare, then I surely don't trust them to regulate my drugs as well. So I think that we can get rid of the federal war on drugs entirely and let the states handle their own drug policies. So getting rid of the DEA, I think, is entirely, reasonable and possible. And, the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms agency and many others, which I think the FDA, for example, like people think that we need one monopolistic government agency to regulate our food and drugs. And quite frankly, I think we should have more agencies. We should have free market agencies whose job it is to score the quality of food and drugs in the United States. So there's a lot of agencies that I think we could get rid of entirely. I don't know that there's broad national consensus for that, but I'm going to take the little bits and pieces of some of these agencies if I can when I get there, and maybe enact some audits. That would be good. The Pentagon actually announced that they were going to conduct an internal audit for the first time since before 9/11. So auditing is the first step. Then the cuts, I think, come later.
So you mentioned the war on drugs, and you are for decriminalization, right?
That's correct, yes.
So what is your reasoning for that? That, I guess, is a little bit of a part where libertarians and traditional conservatives, especially evangelical conservatives, differ a little bit. So why decriminalization?
Well, true conservatives are with us on this issue. The true conservatives agree that prosecuting the war on drugs as a criminal problem rather than a medical problem is a no-go. It's I'd say the big government Republicans don't agree with us on that, but I think there's a difference between a true conservative and a limited and a big government Republican. There's a difference there. It's an ideology versus sort of partisan hackery. And I mean, of course, there are some people who would call themselves conservatives who would say that, oh yes, we think we need the federal government to regulate drug policy. But the problem is that when they make those arguments, then they have to start making liberal arguments about where the government got the authority to regulate in the first place. And you cannot be a conservative and start defending the use of the Commerce Clause in order to say that you have the federal government regulating the states against the entire ideology of conservatism, which should be federalism. That we believe in a decentralized laboratory of democracy. And so, to me, whether or not whatever the conservatives call themselves, I mean, it's really it's a question of do you believe in states' rights? Do you believe in the 10th Amendment? And if they say they do, as conservatives, then I think they have to accept the libertarian view of government. And Ben Shapiro and I have talked about this before, actually, and Ben Shapiro and I both agree that conservatives need to accept the libertarian position on government. And libertarians need to accept the conservative view of institutions, families, friends, neighbors, and churches as the arbiters of the people who will solve the problems that we face in society, like drug addiction and other things. Just drugs are dangerous. I'm not trying to encourage anyone to do drugs, but what I am trying to say is that I think that if we have problems with drugs, they need to be solved as locally as possible by our communities, by our churches, and by the states themselves, rather than the federal government.
And are there some ways? One of the ideas that I guess I've always had is that Republicans always have a tough time actually cutting spending, but one of the ways that we can replace a lot of these entitlement programs is actually with the private sector, with churches and with charities, as you've mentioned, and even with state government. So how can the federal government and maybe you and the Senate ease the transition if we did cut a lot of these programs and maybe decriminalize drugs? How could we ease the transition from the federal government to churches, private charities, and state governments?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, you can do a lot with tax breaks and tax incentives in order to ensure that the communities are incentivized properly to perhaps set up treatment centers or rehab clinics in order to ensure that there's somewhere for these people to go. But that's, again, what the federal government's role in it being very limited. I'd say that probably tax breaks are the minimum that they could do, and maybe perhaps only the constitutional authority that they would have in order to actually provide those kinds of opportunities and transition plans.
Last Friday, Senate Republicans and Democrats failed to pass a continuing resolution to continue funding the government. It resulted in a 3-day government shutdown, which now appears to be negligible as it's Friday and we've seemed to have forgotten about it. Was the shutdown entirely necessary? What was the point?
I think it was entirely unnecessary. The problem was that the Democrats were making unreasonable demands. They wanted a vote on an immigration bill, a clean vote on an immigration bill that they said was a must-pass bill. But the problem is that they didn't even offer any substantive legislative reforms. They didn't offer any legislation. They didn't have a bill that they said that must pass. And so have to wonder exactly, and then they didn't even get what they wanted for the bill. There was no vote on a DACA bill or anything like that. I mean, it just seemed as if they were trying to hold the government hostage, and that they didn't have a plan to actually, make it, to make any substantive immigration reforms, because they didn't provide any legislation. They just said, we want to vote on a must-pass bill that contains immigration reform. Well, what is a must-pass bill? I mean, there's no such thing as a must-pass bill. You have to have amendments be offered to bills. You have to have a debate. So it really made no sense why the Democrats do it. I think they really angered their base, and it didn't accomplish anything.
On DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the program is expiring in March. President Trump has been kind of iffy on the issue. Actually, today I think he announced that he would be for giving amnesty to undocumented immigrants as long as Democrats could also make changes for chain migration and then give funding for a border wall. So where do you lie on the issue of illegal immigration and amnesty?
Yeah, I really just hate that this has become like one of the biggest issues in elections these years, because it's not as if we were having some sort of a crisis in our communities, despite the fear mongering and such. And I'm glad to see that the president is starting to take a more reasonable approach with this. I mean, I've never been a big fan of the idea of a border wall, but if we get some sort of a deal when it comes to to solving the problems of the DACA recipients and the dreamers, and I think it maybe the reasonable compromise that has to be made. And that's probably going to anger a lot of my supporters, but frankly, at the end of the day, we're talking about people's lives here, and I think the president recognizes that, and I applaud him for doing so.
Yeah, certainly. It's always been kind of an issue that's put up to be more than it actually is when you go down to the state and actually local level. And I think that's maybe a little bit of the federalism that we're lacking in the federal government at the moment. Our immigration system is a mess at the moment. Do you have any ideas for reforming that or making some changes to actually how legal and illegal immigration work?
Well, I've always advocated for an Ellis Island style system where you have a strict security check, a strict disease check, and then if you can pass that, then you can start the path to naturalization. But I mean, I think that the problem is that the debate is dominated by the two extremes, right? You have the open borders, total open borders on one side, and then you have the shut them down, build a wall, shoot anybody who comes across types on the other. And the reasonable middle is something that I think is a plan that served the United States well in our history. It was when if you came to Ellis Island and you could pass the security check and the disease check and pass the citizenship test, you could come in. If you didn't, you had to go home. And nobody has the right to come and bring an infectious disease into the United States. Nobody has the right to come in and for terrorism, to come in for malicious reasons and to harm our national security. Nobody has a right to do it. Even the policies, the people who call themselves open borders advocates on the right, the people of the Cato Institute, when they define the concepts of open borders according to their beliefs, they themselves say that no one has a right to come here with a disease or with the intent to do harm, which means that there needs to be some vetting system. There absolutely does. But the problem is that we're incentivizing illegal immigration with our system, where it takes 5, 10, 25 years sometimes to become an American citizen, and you're incentivizing people to break the law. So again, I'd like to return to an Ellis Island style system, because I think that that's the most reasonable path for us to have something that incentivizes people to obey the laws.
And another system that has been talked about more lately has been the diversity visa lottery program that gives certain countries and immigrants from those countries a chance to come here really without any merit or anything else other than having a high school degree. What are your thoughts on the diversity visa program?
Yeah, I think that's dumb. I mean, I'm generally pro-immigration, but what in the heck? If you're going to have a policy when it comes to granting visas to people outside the United States, then I think it makes much more sense to have a lottery system. Listen, I believe in a multi-ethnic society that's homogenous, where people can come and having a melting pot here in the United States. But you don't have a right to come to the United States and become an American citizen, right? The naturalization, the government has the power, the proper constitutional authority to set a process of naturalization in the United States. And that process, if it's going to be restrictive at all, then it should be one based on merit, one that actually benefits the citizens of the United States. And I don't know that having a random diversity lottery is necessarily the way to do that. I mean, and there's nothing that you get. There's nothing that you get from the better a feeling of accomplishment when you have bettered your life and made yourself a valuable worker. You've got yourself a valuable skill that you can contribute, and then you can come to the United States and have a sense of pride and join our economy and our workplace and contribute to our way of life. But just because you fit some racial or gender or whatever, what have you, quota, that is based on some random identity politics, I think that's ridiculous, right? And so the problem is that having a rational viewpoint on these immigration issues gets you no friends, because you're going to, I've just angered all of my supporters and the left and everyone because it's such a polarizing topic. But you know what? I'm trying to put what I believe is the most rational, reasonable, and fair method of allowing people to immigrate to the United States that takes into account national security concerns and health concerns as well.
Certainly, I agree. There's a need for more rationality on the whole. I mean, you see people like Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, and even Sam Harris are coming to the forefront because they're really getting away from a lot of these crazy political partisanship that we've been adhering to. In the last few years, free speech and the First Amendment have come under constant threat on college campuses. You've spoken on a few campuses yourself, including your alma mater, Missouri State. But other speakers like Ben Shapiro, Charles Murray, Heather McDonald, and Milo Yiannopoulos have had their own voices stifled when they've attempted to speak and students have attempted to bring them on. What are your feelings on the current climate regarding free speech and the sentiment on college campuses?
I do think that the free speech is under attack on college campuses, but it's also under attack in the wider world. I mean, the IRS was used to target conservative groups, in order to stop them from participating in elections. So I mean, the college campus is one thing, but I mean, imagine in Wisconsin, Governor Scott Walker introduced public sector union reforms, and Democratic prosecutors did police raids on people's homes out there and issued gag orders. I mean, that's real tyranny when the hand of the government comes in. It's one thing when you've got Trigglypuff on a college campus screaming and issuing the heck people down. It's another thing entirely when somebody conducts a raid on your home. So I do think that we need to have more open debate on campus. I'm not sure what the solution is to that, other than perhaps to deny federal funding to institutions of higher learning that don't respect constitutional rights. I mean, if you can set your own rules if you're not taking federal money. But I would say that for when it comes to real danger, the danger is happening out with the government, when the government's cracking down on free speech, not just when people are screaming at you at a rally. That is a problem, but the bigger problem is what the government is doing.
Certainly. And do you believe that part of the problem of censorship on the governmental level is these unaccountable agencies that we talked about a little earlier, and that they're unelected bureaucrats that really have the ability to regulate and do as they please, like the IRS?
Yeah, I do. I think that they have been. What many of these agencies have been weaponized against conservatives, and if you, what's interesting is that here's an example. So Senator Dick Durbin went after the donors to an organization by the name of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and ALEC was the group that put the foundational legislation together for stand your ground laws in places like Florida. And after the Trayvon Martin case, where Trayvon Martin was shot, and the use of the stand your ground law was used for defense of the man who shot him, Senator Dick Durbin issued thousands of letters to donors of that organization, threatening to haul them before Congress for inquiries. And they lost half of their fundraising base after that happened. So yes, the bureaucracies are weaponized, like the IRS, against conservative institutions. But even the members of our government, the legislators, like Senator Dick Durbin and others, have actually threatened donors to institutions, and that is free speech. If you donate to an institution, that's your free speech. And that's the really terrifying thing, is when you have actual legislators going out and cracking down on free speech in such a way. That's a real threat to liberty, and one that we really need to fight back against.
Definitely. And on those unaccountable agencies, last year, around the same time that the tax bill was passed, the FCC repealed net neutrality, which was a very controversial decision. And then just this last week, Burger King had a commercial criticizing that action. So what are your thoughts on the FCC's decision? And then do you believe that the FCC even has the prerogative to be regulating the internet?
I don't believe they do. I mean, Congress recently has started to craft legislation in order to reinstall net neutrality, and I don't agree with it. I don't agree with net neutrality, but if it's going to be done, then that's at least the proper legal way to do it. I think that the problem is that we have been propagandized into believing that net neutrality is something that it's not. Right? It's like the net neutrality is neutral in the same way that the Patriot Act was patriotic and that the Affordable Care Act was affordable. It's just slang, buzzwords, and so often this is Orwellian language that means the opposite of what the legislation actually does. So when it comes to net neutrality, what really is net neutrality? But it's just demanding that internet service providers treat all data equally, which they cannot do. Like right now, you and I are recording this on a Skype conversation, voice over internet, right? This requires much more data than an email. It requires a different type of connection. And so it's impossible for the internet service providers to treat all data as the same, because if someone is, let's say someone is a hacker, or if someone is an illegal file downloader, right? They're trading in pirated files. Well, those people sometimes use up 50% of an internet service provider's fiber optic of their capacity. And they're doing it to trade in something illegally. And why is it that they have to pay the same amount as everyone else? They're slowing down everyone's internet. I mean, is Netflix a human right? I mean, do you have a right to cheap Netflix? Or that's the problem. Is that's essentially what the net neutrality activists are demanding, is that they have a right not to pay more for Netflix. Netflix is more than happy to support net neutrality because they don't want to have to jack up the prices of their customers if the internet service providers want to charge Netflix more because people are using and streaming more data. It's like saying, if I deliver packages, right? Now, let's say I sell chairs. Okay, I sell chairs, and I want to have my chairs transported from Kansas City, Missouri to New York City. Now, if I want to sell one chair and and take it to New York City, should I have to pay the same price as if I sold 500 chairs and transferred those 500 chairs to New York City? That would be like package neutrality, right? You can't charge me more for 100 chairs than one chair. That's what net neutrality did, was to say, okay, well, the internet service providers who trade packets of data, just like I'm trading, chairs. It's like saying, okay, well, you can't charge Austin more for 100 chairs than you charge him for one chair. It's ridiculous. And so that's the problem, is that we've been propagandized to believe that net neutrality is the opposite of what it actually is.
Yes, certainly. And I did an episode on it, and ultimately the conclusion was that essentially takes away a lot of the choice on the consumer's part too, to choose plans that are more beneficial for them if they're not using a lot of the services that come in the massive package deals. Mm-hmm. Last summer, you were at Politicon 2017. You were on a few panels, including one called Doctor Who on the healthcare crisis. You were with Alicia Krause, Sue Dunlap, and a few others. Will you be back for Politicon 2018? Have they reached out to you?
Well, I think so, because it turns out that there's a lot of liberty-loving people out in Southern California. It's interesting because there were so many people out there. There was a huge crowd of people who were just cheering and clapping. Politicon was so impressed that they said they definitely want to have me back. And this time I might actually be a featured speaker rather than just a panelist. So yeah, right now it's looking good.
I wish the best of luck to you in your race. Where can our listeners find out a little bit more about you?
Absolutely. You can find out more at my website, austinforsenate.com. If you want to find my social media, it's really easy. AP for Liberty across all platforms. AP, the number 4, Liberty. AP for Liberty on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, everywhere. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. Now, again, that was Austin Petersen, the 2016 runner-up for the Libertarian Presidential Party nomination and a candidate for Missouri's Senate seat in the 2018 midterm elections. So if you liked that episode, then you should go back and check out a few of my previous episodes. We have a multitude on the tax bill in the United States. We have one on Bitcoin if you're interested in hearing some investment advice or maybe just learning what exactly Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are. So you can go check that out now. Additionally, if you'd go over to patreon.com and search up Bills with Luke, then you can become a monthly subscriber to the Edge of Ideas and Bills with Luke Scorzell and support the podcast and then get access to exclusive content, which means behind the scenes video, deleted audio clips, and even more. Hopefully we'll have a sticker for all subscribers, and I look forward to seeing you there. Head over to Twitter at The Edge of Ideas and follow us. We are around 700 followers at this point. So pretty good stuff going on over there. And lastly, we would greatly appreciate it if you head over to iTunes and leave a nice, honest review. I'm Luke Scorzell, and you're listening to Bills.